Hello, good morning and welcome to the Wood for Trees State of the Sector webinar for 2022. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the webinar. I'm John Kelly, I'm the MD here at Wood for Trees, and what I'll be doing today for the first half hour or so is taking you through the results and insights from our State of the Sector report 2022, actually essentially looking back on 2021 and some of the key trends and insights that we've seen across the sector. I'll then be joined for the second half of the webinar by my esteemed panelists. That's James, Simon, Debbie and Matthew, who you can see there. I'll be inviting them to come on screen once I've taken you through the results for hopefully an interesting and stimulating discussion on what they see from those results and what they see elsewhere across the sector. We'll also obviously invite you to put questions in either to the panel or to myself, so that we can discuss those as we go along. So first of all, a little bit about the report. All of the data insights come from our Insight Hub platform, where we collate data from a number of charities across the sector, and combining that data into 15 different reports across 44 pages. It covers 10 million supporters and over 140 million transactions. And the reports allow the charities to look and see their own results, but also importantly, and where a lot of the data that I'll be taking you through this morning comes from, to benchmark those against the other participants within the platform. So before I move into the detail, I'm just going to take you through a few of the key highlights that came out of the report. So first of all, some good news. It's largely good news, really. Overall income is up 9% across the board. Some ups and downs in terms of products, most rising, but what we have seen is a sort of slight decline in regular giving, which means that some of the dependency we've seen in past years is falling slightly. So from almost 2/3 of income coming from regular giving, that falling now to sort of 54% in 2021. We've also seen recruitment on the rise, so up 22%, and largely that's coming from community fundraising, which is up 50%, and one-off donation, new recruits into those products. What this means, or what this has meant with, although obviously there has been some lapsing as well, but file sizes have actually grown, and we're seeing 9% more active supporters across the board. There's also some good signs and indications in terms of lifetime value. So looking at lifetime value after 3 years, that's been increasing from around about £100 to £120 plus, and there are early signs that that may be increasing further. One slight sort of downside note of caution, and we will touch on this a lot more later in the discussion, is that 88% of supporters only engage with one product. Signs that that is improving, but what it means essentially is that only 12% of supporters do cross-sell and give in multiple ways. So now onto the meat of the results. I'm going to take you through 3 sections, one covering income, then we'll talk about supporters a bit more, and the final section will cover some of those longer term engagement metrics like lifetime value, cross-sell and retention. As I have already indicated, the good news is that in 2021 overall income was up 109% compared to the previous year. And actually, if we look back over the last 5 years, what we see that last year was actually the best year we've had in the last 5 years, beating 2019 before the pandemic. If I break that down across products, what I can see is actually most products have been fairly flat. Some have gone up slightly, some down slightly, but on the whole, the performance is fairly even across those streams. So if we look at into sort of a bit more detail on that, what we see with regular giving is it's fallen slightly, but is fairly similar to 2020, but is yet to show signs of recovery. However, one-off donations show a very different picture, with a huge jump in 2020 as the pandemic set in and people reverted to sort of one-off donations, and that has actually been sustained through into 2021, down slightly but still well above levels of previous years. Community fundraising has seen a bit of a dip in income, and 2021 again is at a similar level to 2020. In terms of gaming, we've seen a sort of continued growth trend, really sort of year on year. Although it seems to have slowed down a bit, it's still sort of moving in that right positive direction. And finally, sorry, not finally, moving on to high value giving, what we see here is continued growth. So building on some of the excellent results we saw in 2020 with increased high value giving, we see that continue to climb into 2021. And so finally, we look at trading, which is a bit of a mixed result, sort of up and down, slightly down this year on last year. As I noted earlier, what that sort of means in terms of the balance, we can see in the red there a sort of real trend downwards in the reliance on regular giving. Now, regular giving has been a mainstay of the sector for the last 10, 20 years or so, and it's obviously still a very valuable income stream. But it's good, I think, and heartening to see some sort of movement away from that, and to slightly less dependence on that. So moving from 64% in 2017, almost 2/3, down to sort of 54% last year. Looking at income from a channel perspective, we see that there have been some real sort of benefits, some real climbers in terms of channels, with digital and direct mail both up. DRTV also up, and direct dialogue down slightly. So again, looking further into detail on that, we can really see the impact of digital income. Obviously, it has been climbing over recent years as we become more and more digital, but 2021 saw that growth rate sort of accelerate even further, building on some of the innovations and successes that are introduced in the pandemic in 2020. Similarly, with direct mail, we see that also saw a boost in 2020, but actually in 2021 we've seen that build even further, and is now at its highest level in the last 5 years. DRTV also climbing, as I said, sort of moving upwards in the right direction. As I noted there, I think a lot of that comes from a lot more giving from one-off giving through DRTV channels, which is a sign of diversification. And finally, the direct dialogue channel, as noted, it is still significant, but has been seen a further drop even from the levels of last year. Okay, that's things from an income perspective. If I now move on and look at supporters, here we're looking at the recruitment of new supporters and also the impact of that has on the file size of charities. So again, as noted up top, big increase in recruitment, up 22% on last year, and back to levels seen in 2018. And a real sign that new supporters, new people are being engaged in charity giving and donating in new ways. And also, from a positive aspect, what that means is, combined with a sort of drop in the number of people lapsing, we've seen a fairly significant 9% increase in the size of active files. So the number of people actively giving to charities has gone up 9% in the last year. So as with income, I'm going to now look at break that down by product and channel. And as I said up front, the real winners in terms of product in the last year have been community fundraising and one-off donations, but also an increase in regular giving. Other channels, other products down slightly, so gaming down on last year, as is trading. High value giving also down, although as I've said already, the value continues to climb from those donors. So what that means in a bit more detail, that increase in recruitment in one-off donors has seen a real boost in the file size as well. So that's up now 24% in the number of active one-off donors. And really, in community fundraising, we see that even more extreme. So those new donors combined with a slight drop in the number of people lapsing means the file size is up 60%. Regular giving, we have seen decline in recent years, but a little bit of a good sign from this year in that recruitment is above lapsing, and the file size, although fairly static, has at least gone up slightly in the last year. Gaming also, again, sort of moving from decline and starting to pick up with new recruits outweighing the number of people lapsing. Very little change in the number of high value givers. So although recruitment is down, it's still above the number of people lapsing, and we're still seeing the file size, well, not grow. It is down slightly, but down 1%. And from a trading perspective, seeing a sort of gradual climb, and last year that file size has gone up 4%. Looking at products, we see some real winners. Again, the sort of digital and direct, looking at channels, digital channels and direct mail channels really sort of continue to be boosted and benefited both pre and post pandemic. Direct dialogue, interestingly, is back up on last year, although as we'll see shortly, it did take a bit of a hit, unsurprisingly, last year. DRTV recruitment is down. Value continues to go up though, but the number of new recruits coming through in that channel was down slightly across our charities last year. So again, looking through into the detail there, we saw the big jump in recruitment in 2020. That's continued and climbed further in 2021. And a similar picture for direct mail. Obviously, direct mail was in decline, and many have predicted the death of direct mail over recent years. But the last couple of years has really bucked that trend and seen a resurgence in recruitment through that channel. Here we see the picture for direct dialogue. Obviously, it took a big hit, as I said, in 2020, but some signs of recovery in 2021, although obviously still way off levels pre-pandemic. And finally, as noted, that sort of decline in DRTV recruitment continues. A little bit of a look here at the profile of those donors. So I've talked a lot about more supporters coming into the file, coming in through one-off donations, through community fundraising. And what we do here is have a look at the profile of those supporters using a demographic tool, looking at their postcode and using that to sort of simulate what their demographic aspects look like. No surprises here that we see, obviously giving dominated by female, by older and more affluent populations. But there is some shift, some signs of shift of moving towards a sort of younger, slightly less affluent demographic. I think that is largely driven through the sort of community fundraising move to virtual events, which are a bit more accessible, maybe lower value, touch points, and is bringing that new audience in. It's an interesting point of discussion and something we'll certainly touch on later, who these new people are, what it means to the sector and how they can engage those further. And on to my final section, which is all about engagement. So lifetime value, cross-sell and regular giving attrition. So we'll start with lifetime value. And again, as I said at the beginning, there's some positive signs here that if we look at the 3-year lifetime value, that has gone up from around about £100 in 2017, 2018, up to sort of near £120 for the recruits in 2019. Looking at the dark blue area, which is the year one giving, we can see that climbing also for 2020. And so there are some signs that lifetime value may be going up even further. If we include high value donations, those donations over £1,000 and legacies, we'll see unsurprisingly that lifetime value of donors goes up quite considerably, so almost double that if the £100 if you don't include it, and also signs that is increasing, which is also very positive. Fairly different picture if we look at different products in this. So if looking at regular giving, we see much higher lifetime values. So after 3 years, sorry, those values are up to around £170 because of the nature of the product. People carry on giving and the value builds much quicker. Signs though that doesn't seem to be growing. That's fairly static, but you know, it's high value already. Looking at one-off donations, we see a much lower value, so more like around £50–60, but real signs that is increasing. And in fact, we look at 2020 recruits, year one value was already at £60 and building from there. Gaming recruits also building in value, a little bit higher than one-off donors. So 3-year value is more like about £180 to £100, and again signs that is increasing. Oh, I've got back. Great. So then on to the next one, community fundraising, and I've already touched on this. Value is high, the nature of events, certainly in that first year, although it doesn't grow further. But what we are seeing is that drop. More and more people engaging, but at much lower values. I think that's a real interesting challenge for the sector in coming years. Trading values fairly static, sort of medium at around sort of £40 in year one, climbing to sort of £50–60 in year three. And finally, if we look purely at high value donors, you know, clearly the value is a lot higher. So it's reaching more like about £200, sort of £200 to £300 after the first few years. Fairly static in terms of movement going forward. Okay, now a little bit of insight on cross-sell. So headline figure, 88% of supporters only engage with one product, and as I said earlier, so that means 12% are cross-selling and giving in other ways. There is a difference if we look at that cross-sell metric by how people were recruited. So some products, trading, one-off donation, and perhaps surprisingly regular giving there, sort of looking, you know, cross-sell is a little bit higher than average, but high value givers, gaming and community fundraisers, it's much lower, and they certainly don't seem to cross-sell. I think, you know, there's certainly, for me, I think there's a lot of potential within the community fundraising audience to see how we can sell them into other ways of giving. Some good signs on that though. If we look at the first year, so how many people cross-sell within their first 12 months of giving, which is where a lot of the cross-sell happens, what we see is actually that's beginning to improve. So moving from around 92–93% in 2020, we saw the number of people on one product only fall down to 89%. 2021, still time for those people to cross-sell, but early signs is that may match the figures of 2020 and perhaps even exceed them. And so the final piece before we move, before I invite the panelists on and we move into the discussion, is to talk a little bit about regular giving attrition. Now, on average, about 40% of regular givers lapse within the first 12 months. So that's either they don't give at all, or they lapse during that period. That did improve in 2020. I think different recruitment methods, obviously different donors being recruited. Signs as we move into 2021 that might be moving back more to the same sort of levels of previous years. And I think we see a similar story across all the different products that I'm going to show you now, although they're at different levels. So with direct dialogue, lapsing is much higher. It's typically around 55% in the first 12 months. That did improve in 2020, but volumes would have been much reduced. And again, as the channel opens up again, we're starting to see that attrition increase back to previous levels. For direct mail recruits, the attrition is much lower. It's around 20%, although there are some signs that that's increasing as the channel is used more and more. Getting more supporters in, inevitably the pot is diluted a bit, and attrition is going up, but still lower than many of the other channels. DRTV, typically we see around about 30 to 35%, and that's been fairly static. And with digital, again, similar signs of that. There was a bit of an anomaly in 2019, but other years seem to be sort of fairly much on a par. So that's it for the results from the report. I hope you found a lot of interest in that. I'd now like to invite the panel on and open up the discussion and invite you to submit your questions, and we'll try and do our best to answer them as we can.
Perhaps, as I know all four of you have prepared some thoughts about the report and its contents, perhaps if I go to you first, Simon, maybe you could share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, happy to. I think one of the things that stood out for me was the decrease in income from regular giving. So at KSS, we have a large lottery, and that's primarily paid through direct debit. Most of that recruitment, pretty much all of that recruitment, to be honest, has happened through face-to-face in the past. And so what we've seen with that from an income perspective is a very similar trend to what we've seen on the regular giving trends within the report. And what we've seen when we're looking at that, because we only really started to get fully back up to speed with our face-to-face recruitment in the autumn of last year, is that we're not anticipating our active lottery base, or the equivalent would be the active regular giving base, to be up to speed until spring of next year. So we are seeing it recover, but over a prolonged period of time. I think that was one of my key takeaways. I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts on the regular giving side of things.
Yeah, we've also had the same, Simon, in terms of regular giving. I think we were largely dependent on face-to-face, which John touched on during the presentation, and for obvious reasons we'd stopped that. And we really failed to replace that with other channels. And yes, one-off giving has increased, but as we all probably know, sitting around this table, it doesn't quite have the same financial impact, albeit it will drive legacy income longer term. So yeah, I certainly agree with that. The other reflections I had, I was reflecting on this with John yesterday, was that one, I think I find it really difficult to get a single source of truth, I suppose, across the sector. This is giving some results that's slightly different to other reports that are out there, as I'm sure we're all familiar with. I won't name check them, John, don't worry. Yeah, trying to find that single source of truth was a challenge. I think looking at the trend data over probably 5 to 10 years would personally be more helpful for me, because that's how long obviously some of those returns take in terms of regular giving or legacy income, for example. And yeah, the other really big thing that came across to me was what appears to be quite contradictory data on the surface. So you might see income going up and recruitment going down on various channels or products, and you have to really dig into what's happening there. And what is clearly happening, I think, is that you've got certain channels like community, for example, where you're getting increased engagement, but the average value is much further down than it was, and then that's being held up by things like high value giving. And that presents a different type of challenge, not only in the here and now, but also trying to project where that's going to get to in the next 5 years or so, even beyond that, and how you're gearing up where you're investing, and understanding how all those different channels are interacting with each other, like I mentioned with cash and legacy earlier, for example. So loads there. I could talk about it for a long time, but I'll let someone else, Debbie or James, come in as well there.
Yeah, I think it was interesting actually, because when you look at it and you think about how we've as a sector have pivoted through necessity over the last 2 years, the big question that I've got is actually how are we going to see these patterns continue, or as things particularly like direct dialogue come back into play, are we going to revert back? Because I think the big thing for me, and that I've seen in both the Dogs Trust, where I am now, and my previous organisation, is the shift into more digital, and whether that trend will continue as older, more traditional methods of recruitment and will come back into play as we settle and learn to live with COVID. So I think there's some interesting things for me there around how it works from a moving forward perspective. But I think actually taking this moment to look at this on paper and giving the sector a big pat on the back for being able to pivot as they did in terms of maximising income, even if it isn't the traditional ways that we would have done it previously. I think it's great to see that the sector has benefited from this report in terms of what it's showing.
Yeah, I think, like you say, the fact we've come out of this with slightly higher income is really positive. You can't take away from that. At the start of the pandemic, I suspect all of us, whether charities or businesses, just thought, oh dear, I really don't like the look of this, obviously on a human front, but just from a commercial point of view and keeping our causes running, it was that big kind of black swan event, and we didn't really know what was going to happen. I think for me, just picking up on, I think a lot of the points that have been made, the decline in regular giving, I think that there's a great chart at the start of this, and if you look carefully, there's a gentle decline going on in regular giving, and I think if you track back 10 years or more, you'd have seen that as a continuous ascent. And I think that it's interesting that the pandemic has kind of put a load of noise almost into these trends, but I think that kind of general downward trend, which was also happening in individual giving and one-off giving, is a bit of a concern. I think for a number of organisations, just to pick up on Simon's point, lottery became the new regular giving, but it was happening in similar channels and into similar models. That appears to have plateaued a bit. So in the last 2 years, we've seen this huge surge of cash donations and kind of the digitised world of events. A lot of people coming in, but looking at the data, and I don't think we got to it unfortunately in the presentation, but just kind of contactability levels of those supporters and the sort of level of cross-sell that's happening within those areas is, I don't want to be the doom and gloom voice in this, but it feels a little bit as if we had it good for a number of years and we built on some channels and some methods. It feels like those have kind of peaked and we've been buoyed up by this, some innovations in events and a surge of public goodwill during the pandemic. But the task now is just to keep hold of those people and to sort of almost kind of relearn that relationship fundraising stuff that we were doing before we could buy donors. And that's partly about CRM and journeys and whatever, but it's also understanding what these audiences want, because they're not the same people that we were recruiting 10 or 20 years ago.
Can I add to that quickly, James? I think there are some underlying themes behind what you just said in terms of obviously 2015 was that tipping point with Olive Cook and Kids Company and everything else, and that level of trust in charities was decreasing year on year, which I think was almost going alongside the decline in one-off and regular giving for obvious reasons. and we've seen reports saying trust during the pandemic has gone back up again. And I think we need to work really hard to build on that and demonstrate impacts like we always talk about, which we haven't always been great at. You know, we rely on goodwill sometimes over demonstrating impact. But it does show that for the public, like we said, when there's a genuine need there, they do respond, but also there's a slight shift, in my opinion, away from pure altruism. So they want to get something back, a lot of donors, be that a lottery or like I say, be it genuinely seeing what the result of their donation is, not just blindly giving month after month. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity now to build on that increased trust. Can we carry on that momentum, or is it going to go back to where it was a few years ago? Yeah, another sort of tipping point for the sector, in my opinion.
Yeah.
To build off of that quickly as well, I think that's a really good point. And kind of thinking back to some of the bits that you mentioned as well, Debbie, in terms of the different channels and almost going back to more traditional routes. You know, for us, we had some fantastic success with door drops over the pandemic, which is something we hadn't done for about 10 years prior to that. We're seeing really good lifetime values come through from those supporters. But one of the things that's a little bit of a concern is whether or not the impact of increased cost of living is going to see actually another shift happening there. And to your point, Matthew, it's going to be even more important to be demonstrating the impact that the charities are making when people are being pushed into whether or not it's a donation for this charity, a donation for the other charity, or perhaps for neither, considering their personal circumstances. And alongside that, you see the trend that we've seen in the last couple of years, which I think was one of the slides we just about managed to see, which was that increase in the proportion of donations coming from those in the less affluent scale of the demographics. It's going to be really important over the next couple of years. And as you say, you know, we've come through the pandemic, but potentially there's another tipping point just coming around the corner as well.
And I think related to that actually is how we as fundraisers are responsible with our spend. So one of the things that I know both organisations that I've worked for over this time have done is really look at organisationally coming together and thinking about messaging and integrated campaigns and sort of trying to do more with the expenditure. And I think, you know, we'll need to think about how we move forward with that as we look at what impact you know, kind of people's generosity has through rise of cost of living, and making sure that we're spending money wisely within that too, and also thinking about how we are there for beneficiaries as well as donors, and how we tie the two together if possible.
Yeah, I think that the organisational shifts that occurred as a consequence of the pandemic, you know, we also run a benchmark study, which we're working with Wood for Trees on this year as well. But you know, during the pandemic, there were a bunch of people on furlough, but the people who were left behind generally reported working together better, particularly across functions. And that kind of having been around the sector a while and worked on kind of some larger campaigns, that was often absent in the past. So I think that's a real positive. And there's, as we've said, there's also been this sort of shift to digital recruitment, and that's, you know, that was one of those things where a decade happened in a week, because, you know, that was the only game in town, so everyone suddenly really focused on it, and it rose significantly, obviously not to the levels that direct dialogue was bringing in, but you know, there's the question of how do we hold on to those kind of organizational and structural gains that we've experienced during the pandemic. Obviously, I don't wish for a moment that it would go on any longer, but it might also almost be good to kind of have that you know, lockdown mindset for a while still, so we don't all just rush out and buy as many door-to-door donors as we can find, and, you know, revert and sort of go back into our silos and start doing the things we were doing before it happened.
I think there's definitely something about the agility and the innovation, James, I think, to hold on to. So, for example, Independent Age, we launched a grants giving program for the smaller charities, which we did in weeks. That would have taken years before, I would imagine. But I also think there's something about recognizing that there's a potential for this to increase inequality. So just as parallel, I suppose, in that as economic inequality has grown in society, just as high giving has increased as well, right? And it's really interesting to see that there's less affluent more generosity in that group. But what I mean in terms of the parallel is that with charities, you're seeing some of the larger charities who can invest in their digital infrastructure and invest in advertising are really piling in, and potentially squeezing out some of those smaller to mid-sized charities. And the effect of that could be quite stark a few years down the line, because it is essentially ruling out some channels for some of the charities. That's anecdotal based on a few different figures I've read. I'd like to see some wider stats on that. Maybe Wood for Trees could provide a breakdown on the size of charities for this report. That'd be really interesting, just to give them even more work. But yeah, I do think there's something in that ability to pivot and innovate and be able to afford it as well, because I think I do agree it's a great opportunity, but only if you can afford to do it. I'm just aware that also we're just chatting away, and maybe there are some questions that people had. John, Naomi?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
We can.
John.
I'm sorry, I lost sound completely, so I didn't even hear the beginning of your discussion, but thank you very much for sustaining that, and I've caught the end of it. Sounded fascinating. There are, yeah, I'm now back on. I've got the question panel open, so as Matt's just said there, if anybody does have any questions they'd like to put to the panel, or myself, if I can try and remember anything now, now's your chance, because I can see any questions. At the moment, all the questions are about the sound, so I apologise again for that. So great, few questions starting to come in, so thank you people. So could you just let us know where each of the member of the panel is from? First question. So perhaps we should have done that right up front, which I would have done if I'd been online and with you. But so can we go quickly around then? You've obviously already given some of your great thoughts. Simon, quick intros.
Yeah, hi, I'm Simon, Director of Individual Giving at Sussex Air Ambulance Charity.
And Debbie?
I'm Debbie Clark. I'm Group Head of Individual Giving at Dogs Trust.
Thanks. Matt?
Matthew Wilkley, Director of Income Generation at Independent Age.
And James?
Hi, I'm James. I founded and run an agency called Open.
Thanks, guys. And I'm the disappearing person. So a few more questions focusing on sort of what we've been talking about here. How much are you focusing on cross-selling internally versus recruitment? I think a good question, and some of the stats shown in the report there, something that charities probably need to focus on a little bit more. Anybody like to sort of take that one up and give any sort of views, perspectives from what they're doing?
I'm happy to throw something in there. I think from a KSS perspective, we're perhaps quite good at trying to cross-sell within an individual team. So for instance, within individual giving, looking at whether the raffle is more appropriate or the cash appeal, for instance. If I'm honest, we could do more probably on an organisational perspective. And it's always interesting. So I think the stat in the report was that 88% of donors were only on a single product. And I always have to think, when I see something like that, is that being led by the donors, or is that because we're still slightly stuck in our siloed ways of working, which have persisted for quite a long time?
Yeah, I echo that, Simon. We've just done a support survey, actually, our annual support survey, and we asked them how many would like to do giving in different ways, support in different ways. Hardly any of them do, and I think we're not very mature in our programs. We're focusing on acquisition. Interestingly, 88% figure is more like 98% for us. So it's definitely more driving volume before we look at cross-selling, because it just hasn't worked for us historically, and our donors aren't telling us that's what they want to do at the moment. They're saying we want to regularly give or do an event or whatever it is, and they're not really interested in much else. I don't know, the same for you, Debbie?
Yeah, I think we've not really focused in it kind of as an objective, but we just did a piece of work to look at what a crossover is. and we can see that there is a correlation between a particular types of products, but it's not something that we've necessarily purposely gone out to do. But is something that we are thinking about now from a kind of thinking about lifetime value and how we might shift our focus to be a bit more balanced between recruitment and increasing lifetime value and retention of existing supporters.
I think that's really interesting, Matt, what you say there about you know, you've done a survey and people saying that they don't necessarily that you know they give in the way that they give. So you know, we look at those cross-sell figures and say they're bad and the sector isn't doing very well, but actually is it the supporters don't want, you know, they feel that if they give it, they choose their way of giving to a charity, and that's the way that they give. And perhaps the question should be more about how you engage them through that way of giving, increase their value and their engagement with the charity in that way. I do think there's probably areas where people can change the way that they give it, so there could be better cross-sell, I think, on to people who stop giving in certain ways. And I think particularly there I'm thinking about community fundraising. For me, it's always been a thing where you capture someone who's come and done an event, been engaged with the charity. There's the argument that a lot of people are there just to do the event, but you know, there are certainly some people there that are engaged with the charity. Once that is over, if they're not going to do that event again, can they be cross-sold onto other ways of more continual giving? I don't know if anyone's seen success in that.
Sorry, John, to interrupt. I've got a slight delay. I was just going to add that it's also worth remembering that most people donate to a few charities rather than just one. So then to ask them to do more for one charity is maybe not very realistic. And there's also a trend coming through from other reports that younger donors are supporting causes rather than particular charities. They're much less loyal to that particular charity. So I think you need to consider the wider approach to a cause rather than just how many different ways can you get someone to support your specific charity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. To John's point, I think you can convert people from events to other forms of giving. You know, Race for Life basically fed cancer research's regular giving file for years. You know, it absolutely can be done. It's just finding ways to do it, and also part of it is being able to talk to people. So looking at the consent rate for the new, this kind of new wave of event participants, it's generally pretty low. So being able to have those follow-up conversations is important. But in terms of cross-selling, as I think everyone said, it's an unusual donor that has more than one engagement with a charity. Part of that might be because our product portfolios aren't right and we're not offering people the things they want. But I think as Debbie said, if you think about it in terms of lifetime value, then persuading people to give a little more or to give in a different way, but ultimately to achieve the same ends they originally started for, is often the way to kind of get that incremental value rather than trying to flip them across, or not even onto another track, but onto an additional track.
One of the things that we found at my previous organisation was rather than think about it as want to move them from this to this, was more to think about what's the proposition. So if we understand this about them, how do we increase their ability to support us through opportunities that are similar or build that connection. So it's less about trying to say we'll move community to a regular gift and more about, okay, if we know that that's a community person, we know why they've come on board, how do we build other types of propositions into that journey to encourage additional giving or just increasing their lifetime value rather than trying to move them from product to product. So I think it's all about understanding the audience, which is what we do as fundraisers every day, trying to understand kind of why they're giving and what they're giving to. And so I think for me it's less about product and more about what the impact they want to have and how we serve that to them to enable them to do that.
Cool. Thanks everyone. I think, Matt, that's an interesting comment as well about the way that younger people are coming on and giving, and I think that's probably a whole topic that could be explored separately, and what needs to be done about that, and do the current products and the current ways of engaging supporters work for them? Possibly not. Aware of time, just one last question. I don't know whether you covered this while I was off, but I think it's an interesting one coming through here. In terms of what are the key external factors that will impact on giving next year, by which I assume kind of this year, the year that we're in. Does anyone, any last thoughts, comments on that? You know, what's coming up on the horizon for us in the coming months?
I think
we did touch on it, John. Yeah, go on, James. Sorry, you go.
I think Ukraine has, you know, the amount of money that flowed out of the wonderful British public over the last few weeks has been absolutely incredible. I mean, we work with DEC and Red Cross and others, and just the numbers that are coming in are astounding. So I think it's quite interesting, having, I think, seen a bit of a drawing in of our horizons during the pandemic. This has just flipped the switch in the other direction. So I think that's a wonderful thing. It's another outpouring of generosity. That obviously means, in a way, a lot of money at the start of what looks like a very tough period has already, you know, gone out. So whether people are now thinking, well, you know, I've given £100 or whatever to the DEC, maybe I'm going to have to cut back elsewhere is a tricky one. You know, so having seen that big surge, I'm intrigued to see what happens next, and whether we'll continue to be insulated from the wider economic conditions by the fact that our donors tend to be a bit older and a bit more financially secure, or whether this time round it's going to hurt the sector a bit more.
Thanks, James. Anyone else add to that?
Just maybe from a slightly more sector perspective, I think maybe not a challenge so much, but something that we're going to have to keep an eye on over the next year is how much we can learn and maintain the things that have happened during the pandemic. You know, necessity is the mother of invention. And so what is the space looking like for hybrid events, for instance, in comparison to only virtual or only in person, and actually working out what that mix looks like as we move forwards, with a lot of testing and probably a lot of trial and error along the way, but just keeping that momentum going and not forgetting those lessons we've learned is probably a big challenge on a charity by charity basis.
Yeah, I think building on that ability to be agile and innovative for change, particularly in a digital space, while you've got the rest of your BAU back up and running, you know, how do you create that space for that continued innovation? Because, you know, I think, you know, we've certainly already started to see that perhaps some of the virtual things that might have worked the last 2 years, we're starting to see a bit of decline, whether that's because of Ukraine and some of the other things, or whether it's because, you know, we're 2 years in and we now need to start innovating and thinking about what the offer and propositions are in that space. But I think there's something for me around that, like you said, Simon, about kind of, you know, how do we continue to build on what we've learnt and what we've done successfully in the last 2 years.
Thanks, Debbie. Last point from you, Matt.
Yeah, I'm just going to borrow Simon's point from earlier that I think you missed, John, which is just to link it back to, yeah, we've seen inflation today, so looking at the cost of living, looking at the wider economy, how can we weather that storm? That's going to be our biggest challenge this year, and then longer term, it's looking ahead to, we've got this almost golden period, I suppose, of legacy giving and baby boomers for the next 15, 20 years perhaps. And it's not to rest on our laurels and just rely on that and start to plan for the next generation of givers. How do we start to do that? Building on your point, John, you know, with those younger audiences, how do you start to engage them so you've got a longer term pipeline? So it's trying to balance those two immediate and long term challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sort of building from the response that we saw last year, the changes, the innovation that we saw last year. I think the encouraging things that I saw in the report is that some of those things are, you know, have continued. The community fundraising, the one-off giving, and that switch has reinvigorated some stuff, has brought new stuff in. You know, digital has really shot up, as we've been kind of saying as a sector should have happened every year. Every year I say to my team, this is the year of digital. You know, perhaps we are finally getting there. But there are certainly changes afoot, and I think that you know, it may be a few years off yet, but the change in the nature and the way people engage with charities certainly changing. Okay, thanks all. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your input. Very interesting what I heard of it. Thanks for everyone who's joined today. Apologies again for my sound issues and connection issues. But hopefully you managed to get some value from this, got some insights from it. The full report is available, and we will share that with you, so you will be able to see sort of all the points that we've covered and discussed today. So thanks again to the panel. Thanks to everyone for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.